Long before Europeans arrived, Africans enslaved others as punishment for crimes, for the payment of debts, and as prisoners of war. The practice differed from slavery in the Americas. Slaves were permitted to move freely in their communities and to own property, but they were also sometimes sacrificed in religious ceremonies or buried alive with their masters to serve them in the next life. When the transatlantic trade began, in the 15th century, the demand for slaves spiked. African traders began kidnapping people from distant villages. Sometimes a family would sell off a disgraced relative, a practice that Ijoma Okoro, a professor of Igbo history at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, likens to the shipping of British convicts to the penal colonies in Australia. People would say, "Let them go. I don't want to see them again." Between the 15th and 19th centuries, more than 1.5 million slaves were sent across the sea. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans for use as enslaved laborers on the sugar plantations in the Cape Verde and Madeira Islands in the eastern Atlantic. Spanish conquistadors took enslaved Africans to the Caribbean after 1502, but Portuguese merchants continued to dominate the transatlantic slave trade for another century and a half, operating from their bases in the Congo-Angola area along the west coast of Africa. The Dutch became the foremost traders of enslaved people during parts of the 1600s, and in the following century English and French merchants controlled about half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from the region of West Africa between the Senegal and Niger rivers. In 1713, an agreement between Spain and Britain granted the British a monopoly on the trade of enslaved people with the Spanish colonies. Under the Asiento de Negros, Britain was entitled to supply those colonies with 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. The contract for this supply was assigned to the South Sea Company, of which British Queen, and held some 22.5% of the stock. Probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans were taken to the Americas before 1600. In the 17th century, however, demand for enslaved labor rose sharply with the growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake region in North America. The largest numbers of enslaved people were taken to the Americas during the 18th century, when, according to historians' estimates, nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the transatlantic slave trade took place. Some African rulers may have benefited financially from trading their subjects with European slave traders. Slave owners used the profits from these exports to expand their land titles, and buy more African slaves, continuing the cycle of the transatlantic slave trade for centuries until various European and new American nations officially ended their trade of transatlantic slaves' participation in trade in the 19th century. By the 18th century, as the transatlantic slave trade reached its peak, Britain and France were the largest transporters.